Inside every person lives a monster that would make even the host himself shudder with fear. The race that failed to hide their internal monsters were driven to an underground purgatory. He was born in that underground purgatory created by mankind. More than anybody, he hated and loved the monster inside himself. Purgatory is the place where mankind must be in its final moments.
Before we get lost in the weeds, I want to share a quote by Texhnolyze series producer Yasuyuki Ueda. In an interview alongside character designer Yoshitoshi Abe, he was asked a question. In Texhnolyze, what were you trying to communicate with the audience? He responds,
何を伝えたいかって言った時に特にないんだよね自分の中での見てる側にも同じような感じる部分、疑似体験でもないんだけど、なんか感じ取れてもらったりとか、こうかもしれないなってふと思ったりとかね、見てくれた人の印象になんか残ってくれて、なんかそこからまた動き出すアクションが見てくれる人たちの中から生まれたりすると、もうすごいハッピーかな。僕の作品ってなんか多分そういうものでしかない。
Ueda seems to understand that authorial intent isn't the end-all be-all. Whether an author or creator intended to place significance on something or not doesn't nullify the significance we ourselves place on them as viewers. I want to start with this quote because it really underscores the fact that for a work like Texhnolyze, which is so multifaceted and complex, there can be and are manifold interpretations that one can bring to it. Thus, fairly early on, I decided that I wouldn't be working under the assumption of an authoritative account, but instead would see what this work could represent for myself. I asked myself not simply of what was on display, but how it was portrayed and what conclusions I could draw from that portrayal. Turns out, once I really dug in, I found an interpretation that was satisfactory, at least for me. That cannot be said, however, of Ueda's other, more well-known work, Serial Experiments Lane, whose video I'm scripting alongside Texhnolyze. But of course, we'll leave my Lane woes for another video. Yasuyuki Ueda, after working on Serial Experiments Lane, was interested in pursuing another anime that was dark, experimental, and philosophical. Ueda wasn't necessarily thinking of pushing the boundaries of anime as Lane did previously, but as he put it, he, quote, just felt like writing it. After the success and cult impact of Serial Experiments Lane, this idea of another anime was slowly cooking in his mind. 4 years after Lane, the idea started to form more fully. In an interview, when asked about how the production of Texhnolyze started, Ueda replied, quote, when the story, the content took shape inside my head, when I knew what kind of story I wanted to do, I went to talk to Abe as usual. Ueda here is of course referring to Yoshitoshi Abe, who also worked on Lane previously with him, as a character designer and illustrator. After fleshing out the story and characters with Abe, Ueda still had to choose a production company and a writer to write the screenplay. Having worked previously with Chiaki Konica on Lane, he went to him again for his screenplay. After deciding on the small team and clarifying the project, Ueda went to Masao Maruyama, co-founder of Studio Madhouse, to see if he was interested in producing a new animation. Texhnolyze was accepted by Madhouse, where it was developed into a full series under director Hiroshi Hamasaki. Madhouse supported the project despite its unconventional pacing and philosophical density, qualities that made it artistically ambitious but commercially risky. Although Ueda's track record of this kind of anime reassured them to some degree. The animation style of Texhnolyze was much more attuned to realism, which was in Abe's wheelhouse. In an interview, he mentions that one of his previous works, Haibane Renmei, was challenging for him because stylistically, it called for less detail and more color, which he wasn't used to and had to consciously consider. He goes on to say, quote, Texhnolyze, on the other hand, was more up my alley. It was the type of picture that's easiest for me to draw, so in that sense I didn't feel restrained. Not needing the conscious limiter I'd imposed on myself for Haibane, I could add as many details as I wanted into the picture. I like to keep increasing the density of the picture, and the grimy feel this world has is perfect for creating a dense picture." End quote. The character design for the series was easier than usual, as the characters didn't necessarily have normal anime designs due to the realistic nature of Texhnolyze. Most of the characters are wearing normal clothes for the most part, and there are no cartoonish elements present, like the wide-ranging hair colors. Outside of Kano, everyone else has normal, realistic hair color. Thus, the challenge of design here was different. It wasn't necessarily to make characters distinctive, but to create a distinctive world and atmosphere. And thus Abe's density approach really came to inform the atmosphere of grim reality. The soundtrack, composed by Keiichi Urata, further enhanced the mood with industrial and ambient elements. Texhnolyze aired 20 episodes on Fuji Television from April 16th, 2003 to September 24th, 2003. 2 unaired episodes were included in the DVD release. Genion USA's English dub of the series aired in the United States, Encore's Action Channel in 2006, then aired again on the Funimation channel, when Funimation licensed the series from Genion Entertainment. Now, if you've never watched Texhnolyze, I wouldn't say it's entirely required to enjoy this video, as I'll explain all necessary details about the narrative as we go along. But of course, I would recommend watching it, just to gather your own thoughts. This being said, however, I wouldn't necessarily recommend Texhnolyze to everyone. It lives in a similar vein to Ueda's other works, and is more of a postmodern philosophical work than most traditional anime storylines. Now of course, if you're interested in watching it, then by all means, just ignore me and go ahead and watch it. But just to give fair warning, though it's beloved by many people, many others consider it a little slow and tedious at times. But it is also multifaceted, and it's a work that rewards multiple viewings. Now with that small disclaimer out of the way, let's get started. Now, in dealing with Texhnolyze, my first order of business was reckoning with something that came up in nearly everything I read about Texhnolyze. Reviews, retrospective, analyses, they all had to reckon with the fact that the creators of Texhnolyze had doggedly hunted down and eliminated every speck of light in the series until there was simply nowhere to hide. Nowhere for the viewer to find even brief respite from the vast deserts of dark depravity. Of course, I'm speaking of the series' Nihilism. Now, I've heard many arguments in favor of this reading, but I think there may be some more nuance to it. Nihilism is the philosophical stance that life has no meaning, morality is baseless, and that knowledge is impossible. And of course, anyone who's watched the series can tell you of its portrayal of violence, immorality, and melancholic surrender to fate and higher power. Now, though people say the series is nihilistic because of its objective portrayal of these things, of violence and depravity, I think differently. I believe that its objective portrayal is instead a call to each viewer's inner moral compass. In the world of Texhnolyze, the things we're witnessing may be normalized, but we should know better. We should be able to see the actions of the characters as the actions of morally compromised figures, and be able to call out their actions as such. We should be able to see that a world like this is utterly unlivable, and thus if this world is unlivable, the systems portrayed in it that maintain it are as well. Biopolitical systems of power, mafia-like governments, punitive amputation, transhumanism via cyborgization, or in this world, transhumanism via Texhnolyzation, in part or in whole. Now, all of the things I've just mentioned we'll get into, but we have to start at the beginning. The first order of business is situating ourselves within the story enough to continue further analysis. So I'll be explaining the major settings, terms, characters, and character affiliations first, and giving a brief summary of the events of Texhnolyze to start us off. Texhnolyze takes place in a world where the violent and impure, through a eugenic campaign, were banished to the underground city of Lux. Lux derives from the Latin word for light, which is ironic because there is no light in Lux. No natural light, at least. The entire city is lit artificially. Lux is the central setting of Texhnolyze, and most of the story takes place within it. There is, of course, a surface world, the residents of which are called theonormals. Then there is the class, who are a special subset of the surface dwellers who live on something known as the Hill. The class are the overseers of Lux and consider themselves superior. They created Texhnolization, which is essentially an advanced prosthetic. Later on in the show, we will see full Texhnolization, where only the head is kept and the rest is replaced, essentially turning people into cyborgs called shapes. Within the city and outside of it, there are several factions. The Theonormals, Class, and Shapes, which are situated outside of Lux, we'll discuss later in the narrative. But first, we have to understand the factions within the city. Now, within the city, we have the Organo, the Salvation Alliance, the Rakan, and the people of Gabe. Outside of these four factions, there are also just the normal people living within the city of Lux. The Organo are the acting militia and governmental arm of the class. The Organo rule the city via the wishes of the class and are portrayed as a mafia-like organization. The leader of the Organo is a man named Keigo Onishi. The Salvation Alliance is a cult-like group who despises Texhnolization and are led by a man named Genji Kimata. Their opposition to Texhnolization extends beyond simply being Luddites, toward a genuine critique of both the philosophical and socio-political aspects of transhumanism. Transhumanism being the enhancing of the human condition through science and technology. In this case, the technology being Texhnolization. The Rakan is a group that is more individualistic, unlike the Alliance, and is made up of outcasts led by Shinji. The Rakan don't necessarily have a set ideology, but are seen more as disruptors who disagree with the Organo's rule. Lastly, the people of Gabe are somewhat of a religious community who decided at some point to live separately from the city of Lux. They revere Ran, a young girl who is their generation's prophet and is able to see the future. Now, as I was first scripting this video, I first knew that I had to give a very brief summary of the show, just for anyone to understand the main plot points to help contextualize some of the interpretations that come later, but I felt like it didn't really work that well. Texhnolyze, as I've mentioned before, is really deep and nuanced, and a straight retelling of the story honestly kind of confuses more than elucidates, because there's so many things going on and so many characters with different motivations and arcs, etc., that it's impossible to really keep it all in mind. It's all a bit of a tangled web. So instead of a straight retelling, I'm going to take a different approach. I'm gonna just tell the stories of the characters which matter the most to my interpretation. I think this approach really focuses the narrative and lessens the mental burden of trying to keep track of so many things. I also won't at all summarize the whole story, only small parts, and I won't go into super detailed descriptions of the plot, as it's unnecessary to understand my interpretation. And I believe you'd be much better served just watching the show yourself than me just rehashing the story to you. But anyways, with all that said, let's get started. Each of the major characters has a cast of characters behind them that help tell their story. So we'll briefly explore each major character, then focus on the characters that matter the most, which are Ichise, Doc, and Kano. Of course, when I say matter the most, I mean their stories are the most important to understanding my interpretation. Another person may have an entirely different view. So let's first go over the major characters. We first have Ichise, who serves as our protagonist, and whom we follow through a significant portion of the storyline. His arc is a very important one, and will really inform the larger analysis of the work. After Ichise, we have Yoshi, who we also follow through a significant portion of the story. Unlike Ichise, he comes from the surface world, and is in a way a second protagonist. Apart from Ichise and Yoshi, pretty much all the other major cast of characters affiliate with a certain group, and they're usually the leader or significant higher-ranking member of said group. We first have Onishi, the leader of the Organo, Genji Kimata, the leader of the Salvation Alliance, Shinji, the leader of the Rakan, Ron, the prophet of the people of Gabe, and Kano, the leader of the class. We also have Doc, who serves as an entrance into the world of technolization for Ichisei. Doc and Kano are somewhat unique, as they both embody transhumanism, though to different levels, but we'll get to that later. Since Ichisei serves as the backbone of my analysis, I'm going to be retelling the story mainly through his eyes. Now, Ichisei starts off in the first episode as a prize fighter. He works for an organizer named Aida. Now, Aida has a woman. We don't know her name. She's simply referred to as the lover or the prostitute. After a prize fight in which Ichisei wins, the woman approaches him with his winnings while he's showering. Whispered words, which we don't hear, are passed between the two, and the woman starts touching him intimately. Later, we see them having sex. Now, throughout all these events, Ichisei doesn't say a word. No word of consent or even implied consent. In fact, Ichisei seems very submissive throughout these opening scenes. He looks stiff and unfeeling, as if almost resigned to whatever is happening. Now, there does appear to be some inherent understanding between the two, and this understanding, I presume, is transactional and a display of power. On a first watch, it's difficult to really parse any of this subtext, but once you've watched it and understood the larger world of Texhnolyze, everything becomes a lot clearer. Whether this is consensual or rape is never concretized, but it certainly seems like the latter from Ichisei's very stiff demeanor. This is not the last time we'll see non-consensual, transactional sex, and it very clearly says something about the characters engaged in it. Ichisei here is submissive because this is his boss's lover. She is a woman of the class, a wealthy person. She has power over him, as he is a person of the poor, lower class. This is further reinforced by her technolized hand, as only the class can afford technolization. And this arm, fittingly, will also be Ichisei's downfall. Keep in mind this class disparity as it plays a large part in the story. Now, with this technolized limb, this prosthetic symbol of power, the woman tries to push the boundary, touching Ichisei's bare eye with her nail, almost taunting him to take action. And for the first time, he does. He punches her off, and for that punch, he loses an arm and a leg. Amputation as punishment. Keep that in mind. Class disparity and amputation as punishment. The class can have technolization, the lower class can't. The lower class who resides in the underground city. A pretty in-your-face metaphor. Class disparity is perpetuated not just by wealth, but access to technology, in this case, technolization. This makes the loss of Ichisei's limb even more pertinent. To a member of the class, a loss of limb would simply be replaced with a technolized limb, which would likely be even better than their lost limb. With this amputative punishment, they are not just flaunting their power and taunting Ichisei, they are disabling him, which is also a crucial point, which we will talk about in more detail later, when we discuss the ableist society present in Texhnolyze. At some point, while Ichisei is stumbling through Lux on crutches, he approaches a set of stairs. On the steps, he sees a ghost of his previous self, who climbs the stairs with ease while he is now unable to. This is where Doc finds him. Now, Doc is the other character who plays a major part of my analysis, because she and Kano represent the biopolitics present in the show. Don't worry if you don't know what that is yet. We'll go over it in detail a little bit later. Doc gives Ichisei Texhnolyze, but she also treats Ichisei similarly as the lover did. In one scene, as he lay immobile, she also has sex with him. Doc's motivations may seem altruistic, but truthfully constitute an insidious paradigm of control, like manifest destiny, like eugenics, like rape. Assertion of power over others via religious zealotry, political fanaticism, medical absolutism, or otherization. It becomes easy to justify repression when the oppressors see themselves as better than the oppressed. This racist, sexist, ableist view is rampant even now in society. But with the coming of technological and biomedical advancement, transhumanism will only increase this divide and, crucially, increasingly divide the classes. If we can find, even now, reason to put down other humans with our very small differences of melanin in the skin or whatnot, it is indeed an easy assumption to make. In fact, I would go as far as to say it is guaranteed. Of the other characters, there are large tangled events which occur, but I feel ultimately come back to one same idea. Onishi, as the leader, tries to keep order, but with so many warring factions, he ultimately fails to do so. The class whom he serves wish not for just order, but control. Thus their leader, Kano, uses force, coming in with the shapes to create order and control. Shinji, as the leader of the Rakan, wanted to join the class originally, but eventually his final actions were in retaliation against the class because of their oppressive and abusive nature. Genji fights to the death against the shapes. His group's hatred of technolization can be summed up as a hatred of the class and wealth inequality. The shapes are just a mechanical reiteration of technolization and the class's power. It really does all come back to the class. Now, before we get into the analysis, I want to make clear that there are two layers of interpretation at work here. First, we have the overarching interpretation, basically your answer to the question, what is Texhnolyze actually about? And then secondly, you have the detailed interpretation, where you go into the minutiae of each character and see how they fit into and support the grander interpretation. Though I'm happy with my larger interpretation, and even some of my detailed contextualization of characters into this interpretation, still not everything always lines up perfectly. Now, of course, this is to be expected to some degree, with a work as complex and nuanced as Texhnolyze. Its story is not one-dimensional, and there are many ways you could take it. But I think I've struck a fairly good balance, and I'm happy with where I ended up. If you have anything more to add or any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. But with that, let's really get started digging into Texhnolyze. Now that we understand the basic narrative of Texhnolyze, it's time to take a bit of a detour and get a little theoretical. After explaining some of the foundational concepts we need to build a frame of understanding, we'll come back to Texhnolyze and apply the concepts we learned to it. The first order of business is understanding Foucault's biopolitics. Without getting too into the weeds, biopolitics is essentially the way governments assert their political power over biological life, aka human life. Foucault argues that what was sovereign power over the individual shifts to the regulatory power over populations. The best way to explain this would be to use an example. So think of, for example, the sovereign power of a king who is able to execute someone for whatever reason. The king in this case has the power over individuals' lives, whereas think of something like China's disastrous one-child policy implemented in the 1980s, where the state decided to limit every couple to a single child due to overpopulation concerns. This was a systemic regulatory power which affected large populations, not just the individual. This biopower, essentially regulatory power over biological life, was sometimes enforced through forced abortions and sterilizations. The effects of the policy can still be felt today through China's gender imbalance, as the one-child policy exacerbated a traditional cultural preference for sons. Now, as you can probably tell, biopolitics and its resulting biopower are immensely powerful and immensely affecting. State control over a person's bodily autonomy can easily be seen as inherently amoral and authoritarian. The very obvious implication of such a power, taken to its logical conclusion, is slavery, the complete loss of bodily autonomy to the state or other persons. Now, biopolitics can lead to a wide variety of disparities, many of which have historical precedents. One of the most infamous of which is the Nazis and their eugenic vision of the master race. Now we'll get back to that, but first I want to discuss how this ideology came about. Now, again, I don't want to get too bogged down, but essentially it started out with the creation of the norm, or the idea of a normal human being. This idea came about when a Belgian statistician named Adolphe Quetelet applied the law of error used by astronomers to map stars by plotting and averaging errors, and he applied them to human metrics like height and weight and so forth. This created what Quetelet called the average man. Now, of course, if we have the average man, we must now also have the exceptional man. It would be Sir Francis Galton, a eugenicist, who would replace the mean with a median, using instead a bell curve to emphasize the superiority of traits that deviated from the statistical norm. With this concretization of metrics and creation of normal, it now became almost an insult to be average, and that any person worth their salt should be at least above average, or above a certain metric on a bell graph, for tallness or intelligence or etc. Galton's eugenic reconceptualization of Quetelet's work essentially led from the creation of the norm to the creation of the ideal. Now, the repercussions of this concept of the ideal is very apparent even now. Just watch any ad or look at any handful of popular social media accounts. People are now constantly bombarded by these incentives to be slimmer, more beautiful, more handsome, more intelligent, etc. In the modern age, there's a growing disillusionment with being average, and it is seen almost as an unfortunate circumstance. And woe to those who fall below the average, lest they be labeled deviant or abnormal. This brings us to the repercussions of the idea and the norm to disabled ontology. Think of ontology in this case as a state of being. So essentially, the disabled ontology would be the disabled state of being, aka a disabled person. Now, it's easy to see how disabled ontology suffers greatly in a eugenic state. Consider, for example, a society that believes in and practices eugenics, where the ideal is glorified and the disabled persons are labeled abnormal and undesirable. If such an ableist state practices biopolitics and had biopower over its citizens, then the disabled could and probably would be culled. Now, all of this isn't just theoretical, as we have, as I've mentioned before, historical precedents for these kinds of nation-states. These states are also sometimes referred to as suicidal or murderous states, referring to the paradox of the modern nation-state, which, while obsessively managing the health, longevity, and reproduction of its population through biopolitics, it also creates conditions that lead to massive destruction of life, such as in wars or through policies that deem certain populations expendable. Two very pertinent examples of the suicidal state can be found in the not-so-distant past, and these two examples, I will argue, are analogous to the suicidal state within Texhnolyze. These two examples are Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan during World War II. Hitler's final solution, the state-sponsored, deliberate, and systematic killing of European Jews, culminating in the Holocaust, was due to the Nazi Party's biopolitical and eugenic ideology of the master race. Japan's form of the suicidal state came in the form of total war, fully captured in the Ketsugo Defense Plan, which called for the sacrifice of every man, woman, and child. Quote, "The sooner the Americans come, the better. 100 million die proudly." End quote. The slogan captures the fanatical militarism of Japan at the time and contextualizes its imperial aims at whatever cost necessary. This dogged militarism, paired with the unique dedication of Japanese soldiers, led to many war crimes, chief among them the infamous rape of Nanking, also known as the Nanjing Massacre, a 6-week period during the Second Sino-Japanese War, taking place within the larger World War, where following the sacking of the city of Nanjing, Japanese forces murdered, raped, and tortured hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians and disarmed soldiers. These broader atrocities reinforce the suicidal state, which is inherently violent, militaristic, imperialist, and authoritarian, because it must be. The complete control of population paired with the deification of the state make for a turbulent combination. Now let's take these concepts of biopolitics, the suicide state, and eugenic notions of the ideal and apply them to Texhnolyze. First, let's talk about disability and technologization. Now, if we take the examples of the two Axis powers during World War II and superimpose them with the world of Texhnolyze, we continue to see the same stark pattern, though slightly different. The Nazis' ideology of the master race and Japan's total war find their tripartite in Texhnolization, in transhumanism via Texhnolization. And this comes to a head during the Shape War. Kano's totalitarian and violent imposition of a new eugenic norm onto human ontology is thus analogous to Axis fascism. Let me break that down slightly. Kano, in imposing Texhnolizations onto the citizens of Lux, is using his biopower to transform everyone into shapes in the pursuit of transhumanism, just as the Nazis used their biopower to pursue their ideology of the master race. Throughout the series, Texhnolyze makes the explicit connection between punitive bodily harm and the maintenance of social hegemony. Right in the first episode, we see disability applied as a punishment to Ichise. This disability marks him as abnormal, and in the ableist society of Texhnolyze, he is essentially relegated to non-human status. Whereas disability cannot affect the wealthy, as the class have Texhnolization. Since the poor of Lux do not have access to this technology, it becomes a way to divide the population along class lines. Thus, inflicting disability is the class and the organo's form of biopower. Ichise, who was a prizefighter and otherwise a capable individual, is instantly thrown down the economic rung. We see him in a scene lamenting at the bottom of some stairs which he cannot climb. Then suddenly appears a phantom of his previous self, climbing them easily, and looking back at him almost to say, "Poor you. If only you weren't disabled. If only you could Texhnolyze." Now, Texhnolization and disability aren't the only biopowers we see used in Texhnolyze. We know that the creation of Lux was to separate the undesirables from the theonormals. The people of Lux were considered sinful and violent, and thus were thrown into essentially a concentration camp to mine raffia so that the class could continue their use of Texhnolization. Now, what about the ideals? What about the theonormals and the class? We've talked about how in Lux, disability and the inability to access Texhnolization has physically and economically crippled them. But now we can begin to understand the main points of Texhnolyze via how the theonormals and class are portrayed, and in turn how biopolitical transhumanism is portrayed. The surface world we have seen is a ghost world. The theonormals, who have, quote, superior genes, are seemingly completely sterile and lacking any life whatsoever. They are washed out and disregard almost any stimuli. The class, with their Texhnolization and shapes, have also reached in their eyes an ideal or superior state. After the Shape War, we are shown the shapes growing roots and visibly twitching as they bear witness to millennia, rooted in place, unable to move, but able to think. Both these transhuman futures, the theonormal through eugenics and the shapes through technology, in this case Texhnolization, are extremely grim realities. Texhnolyze thus very clearly critiques transhumanism via ableist and biopolitical means. The way it portrays both forms of transhumanism is essentially an endless torture of the mind. And so to guard against a future such as this, we must be mindful and not make the same mistakes as we have in our past. If we divide along classist lines and give access to transhumanist technology to the wealthy, while also using biopolitics and eugenics to disable the lower classes, it will result in a nihilistic world. Visible are the apocalyptic consequences of ableist transhumanism. The creators thus don't espouse nihilism, but are instead warning us against this nihilistic transhumanist world. In the final episode, we see the cost of immortality, which is the loss of human ontology, the loss of the human being, the extinction of our species.
The information an animal requires does not exist within its ecology. It exists in the affordances of the environment, outside its ecology.
The 1952 novel Limbo by Bernard Wolfe captures some of the same ideas as Texhnolyze, including amputation. It could have been a potential inspiration. Though there has been no explicit mention of it by the creators, there are some uncanny similarities. In Limbo, we are transported into a post-war world. In the aftermath of an atomic war, a global pacifist movement has emerged, inspiring countless young men to undergo voluntary amputation as the ultimate literal act of disarmament to suppress their aggressive tendencies. From this, we can draw parallels to the banishment of aggressive and violent individuals to Lux, as well as the punitive punishment of amputation. In Limbo, though, these amputees are held in high regard within the new social order. However, they face a critical dilemma. Their prosthetics depend on a scarce metal, and escalating international disputes threaten to ignite further conflict over the rights to mine this vital resource. This vital resource sounds a lot like raffia, harvested as a necessary component to complete the technolization process. In the novel, the ruling American political ideology of amputation is held by IMOB. There are two different factions of IMOB. The first believe that social hegemony can be achieved via complete immobility through amputation, while a subset believes that humans are meant to transcend via advanced prosthetic technology. These two views are somewhat mirrored by Kano and Doc. Kano wants to take humans towards the next step of evolution through total technolization, and then, as we see, eventual immobilization. Doc, on the other hand, only seeks to transcend human limitations through limited incorporation of technolization. There are some other very important pieces on transhumanism in the anime tradition that bear talking about. The first is Ghost in the Shell, and the second is Ueda's previous work, Serial Experiments Lane. Set in a futuristic cyberpunk Japan in 2029, Ghost in the Shell follows Major Motoko Kusanagi, a fully cybernetic government agent who works for Public Security Section 9. In this world, humans can replace body parts with cybernetic enhancements, and even their brains can be connected to vast digital networks. Kusanagi and her team hunt a mysterious hacker known as the Puppet Master, who can infiltrate people's cyberbrains and manipulate their memories and actions. As the investigation unfolds, the Puppet Master reveals itself not as a traditional human criminal, but as a self-aware artificial intelligence that has evolved from the sea of digital information. In the climax, Kusanagi confronts the Puppet Master, who seeks political asylum and proposes merging with her to create a new form of life. She ultimately agrees, leading to her rebirth in a new body, suggesting the next step in human-AI evolution. Nolan Boyd writes, quote, "The Puppet Master utilizes technology to violate the corporeal integrity of people's bodies and minds, much as Doc and Kano do through their forced technolization. Like Texhnolyze, Ghost in the Shell evinces a similarly fraught relationship with post-human cyborg ontology through its examination of Kusanagi's existential anxiety. Throughout the film, Kusanagi questions her existence, asking what makes her human if her body is almost completely mechanical and artificial. The question the film seeks to ask is, if bodies can be constructed and reconstructed from cybernetic material, and consciousness itself can be hacked and manipulated, what does it then mean to be human?" End quote. At the end of Ghost in the Shell, when Kusanagi merges with the Puppet Master, we are given a less bleak vision of the future of transhumanism than we are in Texhnolyze. Now, Serial Experiments Lane very clearly had direct influence, not least because it included the very same core team: producer Yasuyuki Ueda, writer Chiaki J. Konica, and character designer Yoshitoshi Abe. In Serial Experiments Lane, our protagonist Lane Iwakura is contacted by a dead classmate who says she has found God on the internet. The internet in Lane is called The Wired. We soon find out that this God is in fact Masami Eri, who uploaded his consciousness onto The Wired and then committed suicide. Nolan Boyd compares Lane to Ghost in the Shell and notices the juxtaposition of their two portrayals. He writes, quote, "Similar to Kusanagi, Eri now exists as an internet being, a disembodied and expanded digital consciousness. Whereas this internet ontology was figured as predominantly positive and liberatory in Ghost in the Shell, it becomes nightmarish in Lane." End quote. Let me again clarify that a bit. Essentially, he's saying that Though Masami Eri and Motoko Kusanagi are both these post-human, non-physical beings, their representation in their respective media are completely different. Ghost in the Shell portrays it positively, whereas Lane does the opposite, showing the world-shifting power of a transhuman consciousness equivalent to a god. As the digital world gains more and more traction in the real world, those who can control and manipulate digital cyberspace have immense and immediate control over reality itself. Of course, I'll leave the extended analysis of Lane to my future Lane video, but suffice it to say that Lane really threw me for a loop. It has so much to say, but is also so abstruse in its methods that you really have to divine a lot of your own meaning and make your own decisions on interpretation. It really is a mind-bending anime that I'm still thinking about and trying to understand. For Texhnolyze, however, I think Nolan Boyd puts it best. Quote, "Ultimately, if the series asks us to learn one lesson from its apocalyptic example, it is this. When social institutions of power are allowed to exercise authority with impunity and to dictate along racist and biopolitical lines how life should develop and evolve, they risk destroying the very life that they ostensibly seek to protect. Given the weight of history, this is an outcome against which we must always be on guard." End quote. I think there is more to it than just this, but I believe this to be a significant portion of the larger picture. Though I'd like to say that this lesson has been learned through modern history, it seems that in contemporary history we find ourselves faced again with these same issues. A certain ethnocultural nationalist movement has made it clear that no matter the atrocities of the past, justification for further atrocity is very easily manufactured.